his eyes dancing, and said, "I'm in the choir of St. Nicholas." "Oh, you go to church then," said Brangwen. "Mother does, father doesn't," replied the youth. It was the little things, his movement, the funny tones of his voice that showed up big to Anna. The matter-of-fact things he said were absurd in contrast. The things her father said seemed meaningless and neutral. During the afternoon, they sat in the parlor that smelled of geranium, and they ate cherries and talked. Well, Brangwen was called on to give himself forth, and soon he was drawn out. He was interested in churches, in church architecture. The influence of Ruskin had stimulated him to a pleasure in the medieval forms. His talk was fragmentary. He was only half articulate. But listening to him, as he spoke of church after church, of nave and chancel and transept, of rood screen and font, of hatchet carving and molding and tracery, speaking always with close passion of particular things, particular places, there gathered in her heart a pregnant hush of churches, a mystery, a ponderous significance of bowed stone, a dim-colored light through which something took place obscurely, passing into darkness, a high, delighted framework of the mystic screen, and beyond. In the furthest beyond, the altar. It was a very real experience. She was carried away, and the land seemed to be covered with a vast, mystic church, reserved in gloom, thrilled with an unknown presence. Almost it hurt her to look out of the window and see the lilacs towering in the vivid sunshine. Or was this the jeweled glass? He talked of Gothic and Renaissance and Perpendicular and Early English and Norman. The words thrilled her. "Have you been to Southwell?" he said. "I was there at 12 o'clock at midday, eating my lunch in the churchyard. And the bells played a hymn. Aye, it's a fine minster, Southwell, heavy. It's got heavy, round arches, rather low, on thick pillars. It's grand, the way those arches travel forward. There's a sedilia as well, pretty. But I like the main body of the church, and that north porch." He was very much excited and filled with himself that afternoon. A flame kindled round him, making his experience passionate and glowing, burningly real. His uncle listened with twinkling eyes, half moved. His aunt bent forward her dark face, half moved, but held by other knowledge. Anna went with him. He returned to his lodging at night, treading quick, his eyes glittering, and his face shining darkly as if he came from some passionate, vital tryst. The glow remained in him. The fire burned. His heart was fierce like a sun. He enjoyed his unknown life and his own self. And he was ready to go back to the marsh. Without knowing it, Anna was wanting him to come. In him, she had escaped. In him, the bounds of her experience were transgressed. He was the hole in the wall, beyond which the sunshine blazed on an outside world. He came. Sometimes, not often, but sometimes, talking again, there recurred the strange, remote reality which carried everything before it. Sometimes he talked of his father, whom he hated with a hatred that was burningly close to love, of his mother, whom he loved, with a love that was keenly close to hatred or to revolt. His sentences were clumsy. He was only half articulate. But he had the wonderful voice that could ring its vibration through the girl's soul, transport her into his feeling. Sometimes his voice was hot and declamatory. Sometimes it had a strange, twanging, almost cat-like sound. Sometimes it hesitated, puzzled. Sometimes there was the break of a little laugh. Anna was taken by him. She loved the running flame that coursed through her as she listened to him. And his mother and his father became to her two separate people in her life. For some weeks the youth came frequently and was received gladly by them all. He sat amongst them, his dark face glowing, an eagerness and a touch of derisiveness on his wide mouth, something grinning and twisted, his eyes always shining like a bird's, utterly without depth. There was no getting hold of the fellow, Brangwen irritably thought. He was like a grinning young tomcat that came when he thought he would, and without cognizance of the other person. At first the youth had looked towards Tom Brangwen when he talked, and then he looked towards his aunt for her appreciation, valuing it more than his uncle's, and then he turned to Anna, because from her he got what he wanted, which was not in the elder people. So that the two young people, from being always attendant on the elder, began to draw apart and establish a separate kingdom. Sometimes Tom Brangwen was irritated. His nephew irritated him. The lad seemed to him too special, self-contained. His nature was fierce enough, but too much abstracted, like a separate thing, like a cat's nature. A cat could lie perfectly peacefully on the hearthrug whilst its master or mistress writhed in agony a yard away. It had nothing to do with other people's affairs. What did the lad really care about anything, save his own instinctive affairs? Brangwen was irritated. Nevertheless, he liked and respected his nephew. Mrs. Brangwen was irritated by Anna, who was suddenly changed, under the influence of the youth. The mother liked the boy. He was not quite an outsider. But she did not like her daughter to be so much under the spell. So that gradually the two young people drew apart, escaped from the elders, to create a new thing by themselves. He worked in the garden to propitiate his uncle. He talked churches to propitiate his aunt. He followed Anna like a shadow. Like a long, persistent, unswerving black shadow, he went after the girl. It irritated Brangwen exceedingly. It exasperated him beyond bearing to see the lit-up grin, the cat grin as he called it, on his nephew's face. And Anna had a new reserve, a new independence. Suddenly, she began to act independently of her parents, to live beyond them. Her mother had flashes of anger, but the courtship went on. Anna would find occasion to go shopping in Ilkeston at evening. She always returned with her cousin, he walking with his head over her shoulder, a little bit behind her, like the devil looking over Lincoln, as Brangwen noted angrily and yet with satisfaction. To his own wonder, Brangwen found himself in an electric state of passion. To his wonder, he had stopped her at the gate as they came home from Ilkeston one night, and had kissed her, blocking her way and kissing her whilst he felt as if some blow were struck at him in the dark. And when they went indoors, he was acutely angry that her parents looked up scrutinizing at him and her. What right had they there? Why should they look up? Let them remove themselves, or look elsewhere. And the youth went home with the stars in heaven whirling fiercely about the blackness of his head, and his heart fierce, insistent, but fierce as if he felt something balking him. He wanted to smash through something. A spell was cast over her, and how uneasy her parents were as she went about the house unnoticing, not noticing them, moving in a spell as if she were invisible to them. She was invisible to them. It made them angry, yet they had to submit. She went about absorbed, obscured for a while. Over him too the darkness of obscurity settled. He seemed to be hidden in a tense, electric darkness in which his soul, his life was intensely active, but without his aid or attention. His mind was obscured. He worked swiftly and mechanically, and he produced some beautiful things. His favorite work was wood carving. The first thing he made for her was a butter stamper. In it he carved a mythological bird, a phoenix, something like an eagle, rising on symmetrical wings from a circle of very beautiful flickering flames that rose upwards from the rim of the cup. Anna thought nothing of the gift on the evening when he gave it to her. In the morning, however, when the butter was made, she fetched his seal in place of the old wooden stamper of oak leaves and acorns. She was curiously excited to see how it would turn out. Strange, the uncouth bird molded there, in the cup-like hollow, with curious, thick waverings running inwards from a smooth rim. She pressed another mold. Strange, to lift the stamp and see that eagle-beaked bird raising its breast to her. She loved creating it over and over again. And every time she looked, it seemed a new thing come to life. Every piece of butter became this strange, vital emblem. She showed it to her mother and father. "That is beautiful," said her mother, a little light coming onto her face. "Beautiful," exclaimed the father, puzzled, fretted. "Why? What sort of a bird does he call it?" And this was the question put by the customers during the next weeks. "What sort of a bird do you call that, as you've got onto butter?" When he came in the evening, she took him into the dairy to show him. "Do you like it?" he asked in his loud, vibrating voice that always sounded strange, re-echoing in the dark places of her being. They very rarely touched each other. They liked to be alone together, near to each other, but there was still a distance between them. In the cool dairy, the candlelight lit on the large, white surfaces of the cream pans. He turned his head sharply. It was so cool and remote in there, so remote. His mouth was open in a little, strained laugh. She stood with her head bent, turned aside. He wanted to go near to her. He had kissed her once. Again his eye rested on the round blocks of butter, where the emblematic bird lifted its breast from the shadow cast by the candle flame. What was restraining him? Her breast was near him, his head lifted like an eagle's. She did not move. Suddenly, with an incredibly quick, delicate movement, he put his arms round her and drew her to him. It was quick, cleanly done, like a bird that swoops and sinks closer. He was kissing her throat. She turned and looked at him. Her eyes were dark and flowing with fire. His eyes were hard and bright with a fierce purpose and gladness, like a hawk's. She felt him flying into the dark space of her flames, like a brand, like a gleaming hawk. They had looked at each other and seen each other strange, yet near, very near, like a hawk stooping, swooping, dropping into a flame of darkness. So she took the candle and they went back to the kitchen. They went on in this way for some time, always coming together but rarely touching. Very seldom did they kiss. And then, often, it was merely a touch of the lips, a sign. But her eyes began to waken with a constant fire. She paused often in the midst of her transit, as if to recollect something or to discover something. And his face became somber, intent. He did not really hear what was said to him. One evening in August, he came when it was raining. He came in with his jacket collar turned up, his jacket buttoned close, his face wet. And he looked so slim and definite, coming out of the chill rain. She was suddenly blinded with love for him. Yet he sat and talked with her father and mother, meaninglessly, whilst her blood seethed to anguish in her. She wanted to touch him now, only to touch him. There was the queer, abstract look on her silvery, radiant face that maddened her father. Her dark eyes were hidden, but she raised them to the youth, and they were dark with a flare that made him quail for a moment. She went into the second kitchen and took a lantern. Her father watched her as she returned. "Come with me, Will," she said to her cousin. "I want to see if I put the brick over where that rat comes in." "You've no need to do that," retorted her father. She took no notice. The youth was between the two Wills. The color mounted into the father's face. His blue eyes stared. The girl stood near the door, her head held slightly back, like an indication that the youth must come. He rose, in his silent, intent way, and was gone with her. The blood swelled in Brangwen's forehead veins. It was raining. The light of the lantern flashed on the cobbled path and the bottom of the wall. She came to a small ladder and climbed up. He reached her the lantern and followed. Up there in the fowl loft, the birds sat in fat bunches on the perches, the red combs shining like fire. Bright, sharp eyes opened. There was a sharp croak of expostulation as one of the hens shifted over. The cock sat watching, his yellow neck feathers bright as glass. Anna went across the dirty floor. Brangwen crouched in the loft watching. The light was soft under the red, naked tiles. The girl crouched in a corner. There was another explosive bustle of a hen springing from her perch. Anna came back, stooping under the perches. He was waiting for her near the door. Suddenly, "Will, I love you, I love you. Will, I love you." It sounded as if it were tearing her. He was not even very much surprised. He held her in his arms, and his bones melted. He leaned back against the wall. The door of the loft was open. Outside, the rain slanted by in fine, steely, mysterious haste, emerging out of the gulf of darkness. He held her in his arms, and he and she together seemed to be swinging in big, swooping oscillations, the two of them clasped together up in the darkness. Outside the open door of the loft in which they stood, beyond them and below them, was darkness, with a traveling veil of rain. "I love you, Will, I love you," she moaned. "I love you, Will." He held her as though they were one, and was silent. In the house, Tom Brangwen waited a while. Then he got up and went out. He went down the yard. He saw the curious misty shaft coming from the loft door. He scarcely knew it was the light in the rain. He went on till the illumination fell on him dimly. Then looking up, through the blur, he saw the youth and the girl together, the youth with his back against the wall, his head sunk over the head of the girl. The elder man saw them, blurred through the rain, but lit up. They thought themselves so buried in the night. He even saw the lighted dryness of the loft behind, and shadows and bunches of roosting fowls up in the night, strange shadows cast from the lantern on the floor, and a black gloom of anger and a tenderness of self-effacement fought in his heart. She did not understand what she was doing. She betrayed herself. She was a child, a mere child. She did not know how much of herself she was squandering. And he was blackly and furiously miserable. Was he then an old man, that he should be giving her away in marriage? Was he old? He was not old. He was younger than that young, thoughtless fellow in whose arms she lay. Who knew her, he or that blind-headed youth? To whom did she belong, if not to himself? He thought again of the child he had carried out at night into the barn, whilst his wife was in labor with a young Tom. He remembered the soft, warm weight of the little girl on his arm, round his neck. Now she would say he was finished. She was going away, to deny him, to leave an unendurable emptiness in him, a void that he could not bear. Almost he hated her. How dared she say he was old? He walked on in the rain, sweating with pain, with the horror of being old, with the agony of having to relinquish what was life to him. Well, Brangwen went home without having seen his uncle. He held his hot face to the rain and walked on in a trance. "I love you, Will, I love you." The words repeated themselves endlessly. The veils had ripped and issued him naked into the endless space, and he shuddered. The walls had thrust him out and given him a vast space to walk in. Whither, through this darkness of infinite space, was he walking blindly? Where, at the end of all the darkness, was God the Almighty still darkly seated, thrusting him on? "I love you, Will, I love you." He trembled with fear as the words beat in his heart again. And he dared not think of her face, of her eyes which shone, and of her strange, transfigured face. The hand of the hidden Almighty, burning bright, had thrust out of the darkness and gripped him. He went on subject and in fear, his heart gripped and burning from the touch. The days went by. They ran on dark-padded feet in silence. He went to see Anna, but again there had come a reserve between them. Tom Brangwen was gloomy, his blue eyes somber. Anna was strange and delivered up. Her face in its delicate coloring was mute, touched dumb and poignant. The mother bowed her head and moved in her own dark world that was pregnant again with fulfillment. While Brangwen worked at his woodcarving, it was a passion for him to have the chisel under his grip. Verily the passion of his heart lifted the fine bite of steel. He was carving, as he had always wanted, the creation of Eve. It was a panel in low relief for a church. Adam lay asleep as if suffering, and God, a dim, large figure, stooped towards him, stretching forward his unveiled hand, and Eve, a small, vivid, naked female shape, was issuing like a flame towards the hand of God from the torn side of Adam. Now, while Brangwen was working at the Eve, she was thin, a keen, unripe thing. With trembling passion, fine as a breath of air, he sent the chisel over her belly, her hard, unripe, small belly. She was a stiff little figure, with sharp lines, in the throes and torture and ecstasy of her creation. But he trembled as he touched her. He had not finished any of his figures. There was a bird on a bough overhead, lifting its wings for flight, and a serpent wreathing up to it. It was not finished yet. He trembled with passion, at last able to create the new, sharp body of his Eve. At the sides, at the far sides, at either end, were two angels covering their faces with their wings. They were like trees. As he went to the marsh in the twilight, he felt that the angels, with covered faces, were standing back as he went by. The darkness was of their shadows and the covering of their faces. When he went through the canal bridge, the evening glowed in its last deep colors. The sky was dark blue. The stars glittered from afar, very remote and approaching above the darkening cluster of the farm, above the paths of crystal along the edge of the heavens. She waited for him like the glow of light, and as if his face were covered. and he dared not lift his face to look at her. Corn harvest came on. One evening they walked out through the farm buildings at nightfall. A large gold moon hung heavily to the gray horizon. Trees hovered tall, standing back in the dusk, waiting. Anna and the young man went on noiselessly by the hedge, along where the farm carts had made dark ruts in the grass. They came through a gate into a wide open field where still much light seemed to spread against their faces. In the undershadow, the sheaves lay on the ground where the reapers had left them, many sheaves like bodies prostrate in shadowy bulk. Others were riding hazily in shocks, like ships in a haze of moonlight and of dusk, farther off. They did not want to turn back, yet whither were they to go? Towards the moon? For they were separate, single. "We will put up some sheaves," said Anna, so they could remain there in the broad, open place. They went across the stubble to where the long rows of upreared shocks ended. Curiously populous that part of the field looked, where the shocks rode erect. The rest was open and prostrate. The air was all hoary silver. She looked around her. Trees stood vaguely at their distance, as if waiting like heralds for the signal to approach. In this space of vague crystal, her heart seemed like a bell ringing. She was afraid lest the sound should be heard. "You take this row," she said to the youth, and passing on, she stooped in the next row of lying sheaves, grasping her hands in the tresses of the oats, lifting the heavy corn in either hand, carrying it as it hung heavily against her, to the cleared space where she set the two sheaves sharply down, bringing them together with a faint, keen clash. Her two bulks stood leaning together. He was coming, walking shadowily with the gossamer dusk, carrying his two sheaves. She waited nearby. He set his sheaves with a keen, faint clash next to her sheaves. They rode unsteadily. He tangled the tresses of corn. It hissed like a fountain. He looked up and laughed. Then she turned away towards the moon, which seemed glowingly to uncover her bosom every time she faced it. He went to the vague emptiness of the field opposite, dutifully. They stooped, grasped the wet, soft hair of the corn, lifted the heavy bundles, and returned. She was always first. She set down her sheaves, making a penthouse with those others. He was coming shadowy across the stubble, carrying his bundles. She turned away, hearing only the sharp hiss of his mingling corn. She walked between the moon and his shadowy figure. She took her two new sheaves and walked towards him as he rose from stooping over the earth. He was coming out of the near distance. She set down her sheaves to make a new stoop. They were unsure. Her hands fluttered, yet she broke away and turned to the moon, which laid bare her bosom, so she felt as if her bosom were heaving and panting with moonlight. And he had to put up her two sheaves, which had fallen down. He worked in silence. The rhythm of the work carried him away again as she was coming near. They worked together, coming and going, in a rhythm which carried their feet and their bodies in tune. She stooped, she lifted the burden of sheaves, she turned her face to the dimness where he was, and went with her burden over the stubble. She hesitated, set down her sheaves. There was a swish and hiss of mingling oats. He was drawing near, and she must turn again. And there was the flaring moon laying bare her bosom again, making her drift and ebb like a wave. He worked steadily, engrossed, threading backwards and forwards like a shuttle across the strip of cleared stubble, weaving the long line of riding shocks, nearer and nearer to the shadowy trees, threading his sheaves with hers. And always, she was gone before he came. As he came, she drew away. As he drew away, she came. Were they never to meet? Gradually, a low, deep-sounding will in him vibrated to her, tried to set her in accord, tried to bring her gradually to him, to a meeting, till they should be together, till they should meet as the sheaves that swished together. And the work went on. The moon grew brighter, clearer. The corn glistened. He bent over the prostrate bundles. There was a hiss as the sheaves left the ground, a trailing of heavy bodies against him, a dazzle of moonlight on his eyes. And then he was setting the corn together at the stook, and she was coming near. He waited for her. He fumbled at the stook. There always a space between them. Why were they apart? Why, as she came up from under the moon, would she halt and stand off from him? Why was he held away from her? His will drummed persistently, darkly. It drowned everything else. Into the rhythm of his work there came a pulse and a steadied purpose. He stooped, he lifted the weight, he heaved it towards her, setting it as in her, under the moonlit space. And he went back for more. Ever with increasing closeness, he lifted the sheaves and swung striding to the center with them. Ever he drove her more nearly to the meeting. Ever he did his share and drew towards her, overtaking her. There was only the moving to and fro in the moonlight, engrossed, the swinging in the silence, that was marked only by the splash of sheaves and silence and a splash of sheaves. And ever the splash of his sheaves broke swifter, beating up to hers, and ever the splash of her sheaves recurred monotonously, unchanging, and ever the splash of his sheaves beat nearer, till at last they met at the shock, facing each other, sheaves in hand. And he was silvery with moonlight, with a moonlit, shadowy face that frightened her. She waited for him. "Put yours down," she said. "No, it's your turn." His voice was twanging and insistent. She set her sheaves against the shock. He saw her hands glisten among the spray of grain, and he dropped his sheaves and he trembled as he took her in his arms. He had overtaken her, and it was his privilege to kiss her. She was sweet and fresh with the night air, and sweet with the scent of grain, and the whole rhythm of him beat into his kisses, and still he pursued her in his kisses, and still she was not quite overcome. He wondered over the moonlight on her nose, all the moonlight upon her, all the darkness within her, all the night in his arms, darkness and shine. He possessed of it all the night for him now, to unfold, to venture within, all the mystery to be entered, all the discovery to be made. Trembling with keen triumph, his heart was white as a star as he drove his kisses nearer. "My love," she called, in a low voice from afar. The low sound seemed to call to him from far off, under the moon, to him who was unaware. He stopped, quivered, and listened. "My love," came again the low, plaintive call, like a bird unseen in the night. He was afraid. His heart quivered and broke. He was stopped. "Anna," he said, as if he answered her from a distance, unsure. "My love." And he drew near and she drew near. "Anna," he said, in wonder and the birth pain of love. "My love," she said, her voice growing rapturous. And they kissed on the mouth, in rapture and surprise, long, real kisses. The kiss lasted, there among the moonlight. He kissed her again, and she kissed him, and again they were kissing together, till something happened in him. He was strange. He wanted her. He wanted her exceedingly. She was something new. They stood there folded, suspended in the night, and his whole being quivered with surprise, as from a blow. He wanted her, and he wanted to tell her so. But the shock was too great to him. He had never realized before. He trembled with irritation and amusedness. He did not know what to do. He held her more gently, gently, much more gently. The conflict was gone by, and he was glad and breathless, and almost in tears. But he knew he wanted her. Something fixed in him forever. He was hers, and he was very glad and afraid. He did not know what to do as they stood there in the open, moonlit field. He looked through her hair at the moon, which seemed to swim liquid bright. She sighed and seemed to wake up. Then she kissed him again. Then she loosened herself away from him and took his hand. It hurt him when she drew away from his breast. It hurt him with a chagrin. Why did she draw away from him? But she held his hand. "I want to go home," she said, looking at him in a way he could not understand. He held close to her hand. He was dazed and he could not move. He did not know how to move. She drew him away. He walked helplessly beside her, holding her hand. She went with bent head. Suddenly he said, as the simple solution stated itself to him, "We'll get married, Anna." She was silent. "We'll get married, Anna, shall we?" She stopped in the field again and kissed him, clinging to him passionately, in a way he could not understand. He could not understand. But he left it all now, to marriage. That was the solution now, fixed ahead. He wanted her. He wanted to be married to her. He wanted to have her altogether. as his own forever. And he waited, intent for the accomplishment. But there was all the while a slight tension of irritation. He spoke to his uncle and aunt that night. "Uncle," he said, "Anna and me think of getting married." "Oh, aye," said Brangwen. "But how? You have no money," said the mother. The youth went pale. He hated these words, but he was like a gleaming, bright pebble, something bright and inalterable. He did not think. He sat there in his hard brightness and did not speak. "Have you mentioned it to your own mother?" asked Brangwen. "No, I'll tell her on Saturday." "You'll go and see her?" "Yes." There was a long pause. "And what are you going to marry on? Your £1 a week?" Again the youth went pale, as if the spirit were being injured in him. "I don't know," he said, looking at his uncle with his bright, inhuman eyes, like a hawk's. Brangwen stirred in hatred. "It needs knowing," he said. "I shall have the money later on," said the nephew. "I will raise some now and pay it back then." "Oh, aye. And why this desperate hurry? She's a child of 18, and you're a boy of 20. You're neither of you of age to do as you like yet." Well, Brangwen ducked his head and looked at his uncle with swift, mistrustful eyes, like a caged hawk. "What does it matter how old she is and how old I am?" he said. "What's the difference between me now and when I'm 30? A big difference, let us hope. But you have no experience. You have no experience and no money. Why do you want to marry, without experience or money?" asked the aunt. "What experience do I want, aunt?" asked the boy. And if Brangwen's heart had not been hard and intact with anger, like a precious stone, he would have agreed. Well, Brangwen went home strange and untouched. He felt he could not alter from what he was fixed upon. His will was set. To alter it, he must be destroyed. And he would not be destroyed. He had no money, but he would get some from somewhere. It did not matter. He lay awake for many hours, hard and clear and unthinking, his soul crystallizing more unalterably. Then he went fast asleep. It was as if his soul had turned into a hard crystal. He might tremble and quiver and suffer. It did not alter. The next morning, Tom Brangwen, inhuman with anger, spoke to Anna. "What's this about wanting to get married?" he said. She stood, paling a little, her dark eyes springing to the hostile, startled look of a savage thing that will defend itself, but trembles with sensitiveness. "I do," she said, out of her unconsciousness. His anger rose, and he would have liked to break her. You do, and what for?" he sneered with contempt. The old, childish agony, the blindness that could recognize nobody, the palpitating antagonism as of a raw, helpless, undefended thing came back on her. "I do because I do," she cried, in the shrill, hysterical way of her childhood. "You are not my father. My father is dead. You are not my father." She was still a stranger. She did not recognize him. The cold blade cut down, deep into Brangwen's soul. It cut him off from her. "And what if I'm not?" he said. But he could not bear it. It had been so passionately dear to him, her father, Daddy. He went about for some days as if stunned. His wife was bemused. She did not understand. She only thought the marriage was impeded for want of money and position. There was a horrible silence in the house. Anna kept out of sight as much as possible. She could be for hours alone. Well, Brangwen came back after stupid scenes at Nottingham. He too was pale and blank, but unchanging. His uncle hated him. He hated this youth who was so inhuman and obstinate. Nevertheless, it was to Will Brangwen that the uncle, one evening, handed over the shares which he had transferred to Anna Lenski. They were for £2,500. Will Brangwen looked at his uncle. It was a great deal of the Marsh capital here given away. The youth, however, was only colder and more fixed. He was abstract, purely a fixed will. He gave the shares to Anna, after which she cried for a whole day, sobbing her eyes out. And at night, when she had heard her mother go to bed, she slipped down and hung in the doorway. Her father sat in his heavy silence, like a monument. He turned his head slowly. "Daddy," she cried from the doorway, and she ran to him sobbing as if her heart would break. "Daddy, "Daddy, Daddy." She crouched on the hearthrug with her arms round him and her face against him. His body was so big and comfortable, but something hurt her head intolerably. She sobbed almost with hysteria. He was silent, with his hand on her shoulder. His heart was bleak. He was not her father, that beloved image she had broken. Who was he then? A man put apart with those whose life has no more developments. He was isolated from her. There was a generation between them. He was old. He had died out from hot life. A great deal of ash was in his fire, cold ash. He felt the inevitable coldness, and in bitterness forgot the fire. He sat in his coldness of age and isolation. He had his own wife, and he blamed himself. He sneered at himself for this clinging to the young, wanting the young to belong to him. The child who clung to him wanted her child husband, as was natural. And from him, Brangwen, she wanted help so that her life might be properly fitted out. But love she did not want. Why should there be love between them, between the stout, middle-aged man and this child? How could there be anything between them but mere human willingness to help each other? He was her guardian no more. His heart was like ice, his face cold and expressionless. She could not move him any more than a statue. She crept to bed and cried, but she was going to be married to old Brangwen, and then she need not bother anymore. Brangwen went to bed with a hard, cold heart and cursed himself. He looked at his wife. She was still his wife. Her dark hair was threaded with gray. Her face was beautiful in its gathering age. She was just 50. How poignantly he saw her. And he wanted to cut out some of his own heart, which was incontinent, and demanded still to share the rapid life of youth. How he hated himself. His wife was so poignant and timely. She was still young and naive, with some girl's freshness. But she did not want any more the fight, the battle, the control, as he, in his incontinence, still did. She was so natural, and he was ugly, unnatural, in his inability to yield place. How hideous, this greedy middle age, which must stand in the way of life, like a large demon. What was missing in his life, that, in his ravening soul, he was not satisfied? He had had that friend at school, his mother, his wife, and Anna? What had he done? He had failed with his friend. He had been a poor son, but he had known satisfaction with his wife. Let it be enough. He loathed himself for the state he was in over Anna. Yet he was not satisfied. It was agony to know it. Was his life nothing? Had he nothing to show? No work? He did not count his work. Anybody could have done it. What had he known but the long, marital embrace with his wife? Curious that this was what his life amounted to. At any rate, it was something, it was eternal. He would say so to anybody and be proud of it. He lay with his wife in his arms, and she was still his fulfillment, just the same as ever. And that was the be-all and the end-all. Yes, and he was proud of it. But the bitterness, underneath, that there still remained an unsatisfied Tom Brangwen, who suffered agony because a girl cared nothing for him. He loved his sons, he had them also. But it was the creative life with the girl he wanted as well. Oh, and he was ashamed. He trampled himself to extinguish himself. What weariness. There was no peace, however old one grew. One was never right, never decent, never master of oneself. It was as if his hope had been in the girl. Anna quickly lapsed again into her love for the youth. Well, Brangwen had fixed his marriage for the Saturday before Christmas, and he waited for her in his bright, unquestioning fashion until then. He wanted her. She was his. He suspended his being till the day should come. The wedding day, December the 23rd, had come into being for him as an absolute thing. He lived in it. He did not count the days. But like a man who journeys in a ship, he was suspended till the coming to port. He worked at his carving. He worked in his office. He came to see her. All was but a form of waiting, without thought or question. She was much more alive. She wanted to enjoy courtship. He seemed to come and go like the wind, without asking why or whither. But she wanted to enjoy his presence. For her, he was the kernel of life. To touch him alone was bliss. But for him, She was the essence of life. She existed as much when he was at his carving in his lodging in Ilkeston as when she sat looking at him in the Marsh kitchen. In himself, he knew her, but his outward faculties seemed suspended. He did not see her with his eyes, nor hear her with his voice, and yet he trembled, sometimes into a kind of swoon, holding her in his arms. They would stand sometimes folded together in the barn, in silence. Then to her, as she felt his young, tense figure with her hands, the bliss was intolerable, intolerable the sense that she possessed him. For his body was so keen and wonderful, it was the only reality in her world. In her world, there was this one tense, vivid body of a man, and then many other shadowy men, all unreal. In him, she touched the center of reality, and they were together, he and she, at the heart of the secret. How she clutched him to her, his body the central body of all life. Out of the rock of his form the very fountain of life flowed. But to him, she was a flame that consumed him. The flame flowed up his limbs, flowed through him, till he was consumed, till he existed only as an unconscious, dark transit of flame, deriving from her. Sometimes, in the darkness, a cow coughed. There was, in the darkness, a slow sound of cud chewing, and it all seemed to flow round them and upon them as the hot blood flows through the womb, laving the unborn young. Sometimes, when it was cold, they stood to be lovers in the stables, where the air was warm and sharp with ammonia. And during these dark vigils, he learned to know her, her body against his. They drew nearer and nearer together. The kisses came more subtly close and fitting. So when in the thick darkness a horse suddenly scrambled to its feet, with a dull, thunderous sound, they listened as one person listening. They knew as one person. They were conscious of the horse. Tom Brangwen had taken them a cottage at Cossathay on a 21 years lease. Well, Brangwen's eyes lit up as he saw it. It was the cottage next the church, with dark yew trees, very black old trees, along the side of the house and the grassy front garden. A red, squarish cottage with a low slate roof and low windows. It had a long dairy scullery, a big flagged kitchen, and a low parlor that went up one step from the kitchen. There were whitewashed beams across the ceilings and odd corners with cupboards. Looking out through the windows, there was the grassy garden, the procession of black yew trees down one side, and along the other sides, a red wall with ivy separating the place from the high road and the churchyard. The old little church, with its small spire on a square tower, seemed to be looking back at the cottage windows. "There'll be no need to have a clock," said Will Brangwen, peeping out at the white clock face on the tower, his neighbor. At the back of the house was a garden adjoining the paddock, a cowshed with standing for 2 cows, pig cotes, and fowl houses. Will Brangwen was very happy. Anna was glad to think of being mistress of her own place. Tom Brangwen was now the fairy godfather. He was never happy unless he was buying something. Will Brangwen, with his interest in all woodwork, was getting the furniture. He was left to buy tables and round-staved chairs and the dressers, quite ordinary stuff, but such as was identified with his cottage. Tom Brangwen, with more particular thought, spied out what he called handy little things for her. He appeared with a set of newfangled cooking pans, with a special sort of hanging lamp, though the rooms were so low, with canny little machines for grinding meat or mashing potatoes or whisking eggs. Anna took a sharp interest in what he bought, though she was not always pleased. Some of the little contrivances, which he thought so canny, left her doubtful. Nevertheless, she was always expectant. On market days, there was always a long thrill of anticipation. He arrived with the first darkness, the copper lamps of his cart glowing, and she ran to the gate as he, a dark, burly figure up in the cart, was bending over his parcels. "It's cupboard love as brings you out so sharp," he said, his voice resounding in the cold darkness. Nevertheless, he was excited, and she, taking one of the cart lamps, poked and peered among the jumble of things he had brought, pushing aside the oil or implements he had got for himself. She dragged out a pair of small, strong bellows, registered them in her mind, and then pulled uncertainly at something else. It had a long handle and a piece of brown paper round the middle of it, like a waistcoat. "What's this?" she said, poking. He stopped to look at her. She went to the lamplight by the horse and stood there bent over the new thing, while her hair was like bronze, her apron white and cheerful. Her fingers plucked busily at the paper. She dragged forth a little wringer with clean India rubber rollers. She examined it critically, not knowing quite how it worked. She looked up at him. He stood a shadowy presence beyond the light. "How does it go?" she asked. "Why, it's for pulp and turnips," he replied. She looked at him. His voice disturbed her. "Don't be silly. It's a little mangle," she said. "How do you stand it, though?" "You screw it on th side or you're washed up." He came and held it out to her. "Oh, yes," she cried, with one of her little skipping movements, which still came when she was suddenly glad. And without another thought, she ran off into the house, leaving him to untackle the horse. And when he came into the scullery, he found her there, with the little wringer fixed on the dolly tub, turning blissfully at the handle, and Tilly beside her, exclaiming, "My word, that's a natty little thing. That'll save you lug gin your inside out. That's the latest contraption, that is." And Anna turned away at the handle, with great gusto of possession. Then she let Tilly have a turn. "It fair runs by itself," said Tilly, turning on and on. "Your clothes'll nip out onto titch line." Wedding at the Marsh. It was a beautiful sunny day for the wedding, a muddy earth but a bright sky. They had 3 cabs and 2 big closed-in vehicles. Everybody crowded in the parlor in excitement. Anna was still upstairs. Her father kept taking a nip of brandy. He was handsome in his black coat and gray trousers. His voice was hearty but troubled. His wife came down in dark gray silk with lace and a touch of peacock blue in her bonnet. Her little body was very sure and definite. Brangwen was thankful she was there to sustain him among all these people. The carriages, the Nottingham Mrs. Brangwen, in silk brocade, stands in the doorway saying who must go with whom. There is a great bustle. The front door is opened, and the wedding guests are walking down the garden path, whilst those still waiting peer through the window, and the little crowd at the gate gorps and stretches. How funny such dressed-up people look in the winter sunshine. They are gone, another lot. There begins to be more room. Anna comes down blushing and very shy, to be viewed in her white silk and her veil. Her mother-in-law surveys her objectively, twitches the white train, arranges the folds of the veil, and asserts herself. Loud exclamations from the window that the bridegroom's carriage has just passed. "Where's your hat, father, and your gloves?" cries the bride, stamping her white slipper, her eyes flashing through her veil. He hunts round, his hair is ruffled. Everybody has gone but the bride and her father. He is ready, his face very red and daunted. Tilly dithers in the little porch, waiting to open the door. A waiting woman walks round Anna, who asks, "Am I all right?" She is ready. She bridles herself and looks queenly. She waves her hand sharply to her father. "Come here." He goes. She puts her hand very lightly on his arm, and holding her bouquet like a shower, stepping, very graciously, just a little impatient with her father for being so red in the face, she sweeps slowly past the fluttering Tilly and down the path. There are hoarse shouts at the gate, and all her floating foamy whiteness passes slowly into the cab. Her father notices her slim ankle and foot as she steps up, a child's foot. His heart is hard with tenderness, but she is in ecstasies with herself for making such a lovely spectacle. All the way she sat flamboyant with bliss, because it was all so lovely. She looked down solicitously at her bouquet. White roses and lilies of the valley and tuberoses and maidenhair fern. Very rich and cascade-like. Her father sat bewildered with all this strangeness. His heart was so full it felt hard, and he couldn't think of anything. The church was decorated for Christmas, dark with evergreens, cold and snowy with white flowers. He went vaguely down to the altar. How long was it since he had gone to be married himself? He was not sure whether he was going to be married now, or what he had come for. He had a troubled notion that he had to do something or other. He saw his wife's bonnet and wondered why she wasn't there with him. They stood before the altar. He was staring up at the east window that glowed intensely, a sort of blue-purple. It was deep blue glowing, and some crimson, and little yellow flowers held fast in veins of shadow, in a heavy web of darkness. How it burned alive in radiance among its black web. Who giveth this woman to be married to this man? He felt somebody touch him.
He started.
The words still re-echoed in his memory, but were drawing off. Me, he said hastily. Anna bent her head and smiled in her veil. How absurd he was. Brangwen was staring away at the burning blue window at the back of the altar and wondering vaguely, with pain, if he ever should get old, if he ever should feel arrived and established. He was here at Anna's wedding. Well, what right had he to feel responsible, like a father? He was still as unsure and unfixed as when he had married himself. His wife and he. With a pang of anguish, he realized what uncertainties they both were. He was a man of 45. 45. In 5 more years, 50. Then 60, then 70. Then it was finished. My God. And one still was so unestablished. How did one grow old? How could one become confident? He wished he felt older. Why? What difference was there, as far as he felt matured or completed, between him now and him at his own wedding? He might be getting married over again, he and his wife. He felt himself tiny, a little, upright figure on a plain circled round with the immense, roaring sky. He and his wife, 2 little, upright figures walking across this plain, whilst the heavens shimmered and roared about them. When did one come to an end? In which direction was it finished? There was no end, no finish, only this roaring vast space. Did one never get old, never die? That was the clue. He exulted strangely, with torture. He would go on with his wife, he and she like 2 children camping in the plains. What was sure but the endless sky? But that was so sure, so boundless. Still the royal blue color burned and blazed and sported itself in the web of darkness before him, unwearyingly rich and splendid. How rich and splendid his own life was, red and burning and blazing and sporting itself in the dark meshes of his body. And his wife, how she glowed and burned dark within her meshes. Always it was so unfinished and unformed. There was a loud noise of the organ. The whole party was trooping to the vestry. There was a blotted, scrawled book, and that young girl putting back her veil at her vanity and laying her hand with the wedding ring self-consciously conspicuous and signing her name proudly because of the vain spectacle she made. Anna Teresa Lenskoi. Anna Teresa Lenskoi. What a vain, independent minx she was. The bridegroom, slender in his black swallowtail and gray trousers, solemn as a young solemn cat, was writing seriously. William Brangwen. That looked more like it. Come and sign, father, cried the imperious young hussy. Thomas Brangwen Clumsyfist, he said to himself as he signed. Then his brother, a big, sallow fellow with black side whiskers, wrote,
Alfred Brangwen.
How many more Brangwens? Said Tom Brangwen, ashamed of the too frequent recurrence of his family name. When they were out again in the sunshine, and he saw the frost hoary and blue among the long grass under the tombstones, the holly berries overhead twinkling scarlet as the bells rang, the yew trees hanging their black, motionless, ragged boughs, everything seemed like a vision. The marriage party went across the graveyard to the wall, mounted it by the little steps, and ascended. Oh, a vain white peacock of a bride perching herself on the top of the wall and giving her hand to the bridegroom on the other side, to be helped down. The vanity of her white, slim, daintily stepping feet, and her arched neck, and the regal impudence with which she seemed to dismiss them all, the others, parents and wedding guests, as she went with her young husband. In the cottage big fires were burning. There were dozens of glasses on the table, and holly and mistletoe hanging up. The wedding party crowded in, and Tom Brangwen, becoming roisterous, poured out drinks. Everybody must drink. The bells were ringing away against the windows. Lift your glasses up, shouted Tom Brangwen from the parlor. Lift your glasses up, and drink to the hearth and home. Hearth and home, and may they enjoy it. Night and day, and may they enjoy it, shouted Frank Brangwen in addition. Hammer and tongs, and may they enjoy it, shouted Alfred Brangwen the Saturnine. Fill your glasses up and let's have it all over again, shouted Tom Brangwen. Hearth and home, and may ye enjoy it. There was a ragged shout of the company in response. That and blessin' and may ye enjoy it, shouted Frank Brangwen. There was a swelling chorus in answer. Comin' and goin' and may ye enjoy it, shouted the Saturnine Alfred Brangwen, and the men roared by now boldly, and the women said, just hark now. There was a touch of scandal in the air. Then the party rolled off in the carriages, full speed back to the marsh, to a large meal of the high tea order, which lasted for an hour and a half. The bride and bridegroom sat at the head of the table, very prim and shining both of them, wordless, whilst the company raged down the table. The Brangwen men had brandy in their tea and were becoming unmanageable. The Saturnine Alfred had glittering, unseeing eyes and a strange, fierce way of laughing that showed his teeth. His wife glowered at him and jerked her head at him like a snake. He was oblivious. Frank Brangwen, the butcher, flushed and florid and handsome, roared echoes to his two brothers. Tom Brangwen, in his solid fashion, was letting himself go at last. These three brothers dominated the whole company. Tom Brangwen wanted to make a speech. For the first time in his life, he must spread himself wordily. Marriage, he began, his eyes twinkling and yet quite profound, for he was deeply serious and hugely amused at the same time. Marriage, he said, speaking in the slow, full-mouthed way of the Brangwens, is what we're made for. Let him talk, said Alfred Brangwen, slowly and inscrutably. Let him talk. Mrs. Alfred darted indignant eyes at her husband. A man, continued Tom Brangwen, enjoys being a man. For what purpose was he made a man, if not to enjoy it? That a true word, said Frank floridly. And likewise, continued Tom Brangwen, a woman enjoys being a woman. At least we surmise she does. Oh, don't you bother, called a farmer's wife. You may back your life, they be summasin, said Frank's wife. Now, continued Tom Brangwen, for a man to be a man, it takes a woman. It does that, said a woman grimly. And for a woman to be a woman, it takes a man, continued Tom Brangwen. All speak up, men, chimed in a feminine voice. Therefore we have marriage, continued Tom Brangwen. Hold, said Alfred Brangwen. Don't run us off our legs. And in dead silence the glasses were filled. The bride and bridegroom, two children, sat with intent, shining faces at the head of the table, abstracted. There's no marriage in heaven, went on Tom Brangwen, but on earth there is marriage. That's the difference between said Alfred Brangwen, mocking. Alfred, said Tom Brangwen, keep your remarks till afterwards, and then we'll thank you for them. There's very little else on earth but marriage. You can talk about making money or saving souls. You can save your own soul 7 times over, and you may have a mint of money, but your soul goes gnawing, and it says there's something it must have. In heaven there is no marriage, but on earth there is marriage, else heaven drops out, and there's no bottom to it. Just hark you now, said Frank's wife. Go on, Thomas, said Alfred sardonically. If we've got to be angels, went on Tom Brangwen, haranguing the company at large, and if there is no such thing as a man nor a woman amongst them, then it seems to me as a married couple makes one angel. It's the brandy, said Alfred Brangwen wearily. For, said Tom Brangwen, and the company was listening to the conundrum, an angel can't be less than a human being. And if it was only the soul of a man minus the man, then it would be less than a human being. Decidedly, said Alfred. And a laugh went round the table. But Tom Brangwen was inspired. An angel's got to be more than a human being, he continued. So I say, an angel is the soul of man and woman in one. They rise united at the judgment day as one angel. Praising the Lord, said Frank. Praising the Lord, repeated Tom. And what about the women left over? Asked Alfred, jeering. The company was getting uneasy. That I can't tell. How do I know as there is anybody left over at the judgment day? Let that be. What I say is that when a man's soul and a woman's soul unites together, that makes an angel. I dunno about souls. I know as 1 plus 1 makes 3 sometimes, said Frank, but he had the laugh to himself. Bodies and souls, it's the same, said Tom. And what about your missus, who was married before you knew her? Asked Alfred, set on edge by this discourse. That I can't tell you. If I am to become an angel, it'll be my married soul, and not my single soul. It'll not be the soul of me when I was a lad, for I hadn't a soul as would make an angel then. I can always remember, said Frank's wife, when our Harold was bad, he did nothing but see an angel at tobacco looking glass. Look, mother, he said, at that angel. There isn't no angel, my duck, I said, but he wouldn't have it. I took Tach looking glass off and Tach dressing table, but it made no difference. He kept on saying it was there. My word, it did give me a turn. I thought for sure as I'd lost him. I can remember, said another man, Tom's sister's husband. My mother gave me a good hidin' once for saying I got an angel up my nose. She seed me pokin' and she said, "What are you pokin' at your nose for? Give over." "There's an angel up it," I said, and she fetched me such a wipe. But there was. We used to call them thistle things angels as wafts about, and I'd pushed one o' these at my nose, for some reason or other. It's wonderful what children will get up their noses, said Frank's wife. I see and remember our Hemi. She shoved one o' them bluebell things out of middle of a bluebell, what they call candles, up her nose, and oh, we had some work. I'd seen her stickin'. I'm on the end of her nose, like, but I never thought she'd be so soft as to shove it right up. She was a gel of 8 or more. Oh, my word, we got a crochet hook and I don't know what. Tom Brangwen's mood of inspiration began to pass away. He forgot all about it and was soon roaring and shouting with the rest. Outside the wake came, singing the carols. They were invited into the bursting house. They had 2 fiddles and a piccolo. There in the parlor they played carols, and the whole company sang them at the top of its voice. Only the bride and bridegroom sat with shining eyes and strange, bright faces and scarcely sang, or only with just moving lips. The wake departed, and the geysers came. There was loud applause and shouting and excitement as the old mystery play of St. George, in which every man present had acted as a boy, proceeded, with banging and thumping of club and dripping pan. By Jove, I got a crack once, when I was playing Beelzebub, said Tom Brangwen, his eyes full of water with laughing. It knocked all sense out of me as you'd crack an egg. But I tell you, when I come to, I played old Johnny Roger with St. George. I did that. He was shaking with laughter. Another knock came at the door. There was a hush. It's T.H. Cab, said somebody from the door. Walk in, shouted Tom Brangwen, and a red-faced, grinning man entered. Now, you two, get yourselves ready and off to blanket fair, shouted Tom Brangwen. Strike a daisy, but if you're not off like a blink o' lightnin', you shanna go. U.S.'ll sleep separate. Anna rose silently and went to change her dress. Well, Brangwen would have gone out, but Tilly came with his hat and coat. The youth was helped on. Well, here's luck, my boy, shouted his father. When 'tis fats in fire, let it frizzle, admonished his uncle Frank. Fair and softly does it, fair and softly does it, cried his aunt, Frank's wife, contrary. You don't want to fall over yourself, said his uncle by marriage. You're not a bull at a gate. Let a man have his own road, said Tom Brangwen testily. Don't be so free of your advice. It's his wedding this time, not yours. You don't want many signposts, said his father. There's some roads a man has to be led, and there's some roads a boss-eyed man can only follow why one eye shut. But this road can't be lost by a blind man, nor a boss-eyed man, nor a cripple, and he's neither, thank God. Don't you be so sure o' your walkin' powers, cried Frank's wife. There's many a man gets no further than halfway, nor can't to save his life. Let him live forever. Why, how do you know? Said Alfred. It's plain enough in 't looks some, retorted Lizzie, his sister-in-law. The youth stood with a faint, half-hearing smile on his face. He was tense and abstracted. These things, or anything, scarcely touched him. Anna came down in her day dress, very elusive. She kissed everybody, men and women, while Brangwen shook hands with everybody, kissed his mother, who began to cry, and the whole party went surging out to the cab. The young couple were shut up. Last injunction shouted at them. "Drive on," shouted Tom Brangwen. The cab rolled off. They saw the light diminish under the ash trees. Then the whole party, quietened, went indoors. "They'll have 3 good fires burning," said Tom Brangwen, looking at his watch. "I told Emma to make 'em up at 9, and then leave the door on to latch. It's only past. They'll have 3 fires burning, and lamps lighted, and Emma will ha warm to bed while I teach warm in pan. So I st think they'll be all right." The party was much quieter. They talked of the young couple. "She said she didn't want a servant in," said Tom Brangwen. "The house isn't big enough. She'd always have the creature under her nose. Emma'll do what is wanted of her, and they'll be to themselves." "It's best," said Lizzie. "You're more free." The party talked on slowly. Brangwen looked at his watch. "Let's go and give Emma carol," he said. "We us'll find 2 fiddles at the Cock and Robin." "Aye, come on," said Frank. Alfred rose in silence. The brother-in-law and one of Will's brothers rose also. The 5 men went out. The night was flashing with stars. Sirius blazed like a signal at the side of the hill. Orion, stately and magnificent, was sloping along. Tom walked with his brother, Alfred. The men's heels rang on the ground. "It's a fine night," said Tom. "Aye," said Alfred. "Nice to get out."
Aye.
The brothers walked close together, the bond of blood strong between them. Tom always felt very much the junior to Alfred. "It's a long while since you left home," he said. "Aye," said Alfred. "I thought I was getting a bit oldish, but I'm not. It's the things you've got as gets worn out. It's not you yourself." "Why, what's worn out?" "Most folks as I've anything to do with, as has anything to do with me, they all break down. You've got to go on by yourself, if it's only to perdition. There's nobody going alongside even there." Tom Brangwen meditated this. "Maybe he was never broken in," he said. "No, I never was," said Alfred proudly. And Tom felt his elder brother despised him a little. He winced under it. "Everybody's got a way of their own," he said, stubbornly. "It's only a dog as hasn't, and them as can't take what they give and give what they take. They must go by themselves, or get a dog as'll follow 'em." "They can do without the dog," said his brother. And again Tom Brangwen was humble, thinking his brother was bigger than himself. But if he was, he was. And if it were finer to go alone, it was. He did not want to go for all that. They went over the field, where a thin, keen wind blew round the ball of the hill, in the starlight. They came to the stile, and to the side of Anna's house. The lights were out, only on the blinds of the rooms downstairs, and of a bedroom upstairs. Firelight flickered. "We'd better leave them alone," said Alfred Brangwen. "Nay, nay," said Tom. "We'll carol for tit last time." And in a quarter of an hour's time, 11 silent, rather tipsy men scrambled over the wall and into the garden by the yew trees, outside the windows where faint firelight glowered on the blinds. There came a shrill sound, 2 violins and a piccolo shrilling on the frosty air. In the fields with their flocks abiding, a commotion of men's voices broke out singing in ragged unison. Anna Brangwen had started up, listening, when the music began. She was afraid. "It's the wake," he whispered. She remained tense, her heart beating heavily, possessed with strange, strong fear. Then there came the burst of men singing, rather uneven. She strained still, listening. "It's Dad," she said in a low voice. They were silent, listening. "And my father," he said. She listened still, but she was sure. She sank down again into bed, into his arms. He held her very close, kissing her. The hymn rambled on outside, all the men singing their best, having forgotten everything else under the spell of the fiddles and the tune. The firelight glowed against the darkness in the room. Anna could hear her father singing with gusto. "Aren't they silly?" she whispered. And they crept closer, closer together, hearts beating to one another. And even as the hymn rolled on, they ceased to hear it. 6. Anna Victrix. Well, Brangwen had some weeks of holiday after his marriage, so the two took their honeymoon in full hands, alone in their cottage together. And to him, as the days went by, It was as if the heavens had fallen, and he were sitting with her among the ruins, in a new world, everybody else buried, themselves two blissful survivors, with everything to squander as they would. At first, he could not get rid of a culpable sense of license on his part. Wasn't there some duty outside calling him, and he did not come? It was all very well at night, when the doors were locked and the darkness drawn round the two of them. Then they were the only inhabitants of the visible earth. The rest were under the flood. And being alone in the world, they were a law unto themselves. They could enjoy and squander and waste like conscienceless gods. But in the morning, as the carts clinked by and children shouted down the lane, as the hucksters came calling their wares, and the church clock struck 11, and he and she had not got up yet, even to breakfast, he could not help feeling guilty, as if he were committing a breach of the law, ashamed that he was not up and doing. "Doing what?" she asked. "What is there to do? You will only lounge about." Still, even lounging about was respectable. One was at least in connection with the world, then. Whereas now, lying so still and peacefully, while the daylight came obscurely through the drawn blind, one was severed from the world. One shut oneself off in tacit denial of the world. And he was troubled, but it was so sweet and satisfying lying there talking desultorily with her. It was sweeter than sunshine, and not so evanescent. It was even irritating the way the church clock kept on chiming. There seemed no space between the hours, just a moment, golden and still, whilst she traced his features with her fingertips, utterly careless and happy, and he loved her to do it. But he was strange and unused. So suddenly, everything that had been before was shed away and gone. One day, he was a bachelor living with the world. The next day, he was with her, as remote from the world as if the two of them were buried like a seed in darkness. Suddenly, like a chestnut falling out of a burr, he was shed naked and glistening on to a soft, fecund earth, leaving behind him the hard rind of worldly knowledge and experience. He heard it in the hucksters' cries, the noise of carts, the calling of children. And it was all like the hard, shed rind discarded. Inside, in the softness and stillness of the room, was the naked kernel that palpitated in silent activity, absorbed in reality. Inside the room was a great steadiness, a core of living eternity. Only far outside, at the rim, went on the noise and the destruction. Here at the center, the great wheel was motionless, centered upon itself. Here was a poised, unflawed stillness that was beyond time, because it remained the same, inexhaustible, unchanging, unexhausted. As they lay close together, complete and beyond the touch of time or change, it was as if they were at the very center of all the slow wheeling of space and the rapid agitation of life. Deep, deep inside them all, at the center where there is utter radiance and eternal being and the silence absorbed in praise, the steady core of all movements, the unawakened sleep of all wakefulness. They found themselves there, and they lay still, in each other's arms. For their moment they were at the heart of eternity, whilst time roared far off, forever far off, towards the rim. Then gradually they were passed away from the supreme center, down the circles of praise and joy and gladness, further and further out, towards the noise and the friction. But their hearts had burned and were tempered by the inner reality. They were unalterably glad. Gradually they began to wake up. The noises outside became more real. They understood and answered the call outside. They counted the strokes of the bell. And when they counted midday, they understood that it was midday in the world and for themselves also. It dawned upon her that she was hungry. She had been getting hungrier for a lifetime. But even yet it was not sufficiently real to rouse her. A long way off she could hear the words, "I am dying of hunger." Yet she lay still, separate, at peace, and the words were unuttered. There was still another lapse. And then, quite calmly, even a little surprised, she was in the present, and was saying, "I am dying with hunger." "So am I," he said calmly, as if it were of not the slightest significance. And they relapsed into the warm, golden stillness, and the minutes flowed unheeded past the window outside. Then suddenly she stirred against him. "My dear, I am dying of hunger," she said. It was a slight pain to him to be brought to. "We'll get up," he said, unmoving. And she sank her head onto him again, and they lay still, lapsing. Half consciously, he heard the clock chime the hour. She did not hear. "Do get up," she murmured at length, "and give me something to eat." "Yes," he said, and he put his arms round her, and she lay with her face on him. They were faintly astonished that they did not move. The minutes rustled louder at the window. "Let me go then," he said. She lifted her head from him, relinquishingly. With a little breaking away, he moved out of bed and was taking his clothes. She stretched out her hand to him. "You are so nice," she said, and he went back for a moment or two. Then actually, he did slip into some clothes and, looking round quickly at her, was gone out of the room. She lay translated again into a pale, clearer peace. As if she were a spirit, she listened to the noise of him downstairs, as if she were no longer of the material world. It was 1:30. He looked at the silent kitchen, untouched from last night, dim with the drawn blind, and he hastened to draw up the blind, so people should know they were not in bed any later. Well, it was his own house, it did not matter. Hastily, he put wood in the grate and made a fire. He exulted in himself, like an adventurer on an undiscovered island. The fire blazed up, he put on the kettle. How happy he felt! How still and secluded the house was. There were only he and she in the world. But when he unbolted the door and, half-dressed, looked out, he felt furtive and guilty. The world was there, after all. And he had felt so secure, as though this house were the ark in the flood, and all the rest was drowned. The world was there, and it was afternoon. The morning had vanished and gone by. The day was growing old. Where was the bright, fresh morning? He was accused. Was the morning gone, and he had lain with blinds drawn? Let it pass by unnoticed? He looked again round the chill, gray afternoon, and he himself so soft and warm and glowing. There were 2 sprigs of yellow jasmine in the saucer that covered the milk jug. He wondered who had been and left the sign. Taking the jug, he hastily shut the door. Let the day and the daylight drop out. Let it go by unseen. He did not care. What did one day more or less matter to him? It could fall into oblivion unspent if it liked, this one course of daylight. "Somebody has been and found the door locked," he said when he went upstairs with the tray. He gave her the 2 sprigs of jasmine. She laughed as she sat up in bed, childishly threading the flowers in the breast of her nightdress. Her brown hair stuck out like a nimbus, all fierce, round her softly glowing face. Her dark eyes watched the tray eagerly. "How good," she cried, sniffing the cold air. "I'm glad you did a lot." And she stretched out her hands eagerly for her plate. "Come back to bed, quick, it's cold." She rubbed her hands together sharply. He put off what little clothing he had on and sat beside her in the bed. "You look like a lion, with your mane sticking out and your nose pushed over your food," he said. She tinkled with laughter and gladly ate her breakfast. The morning was sunk away unseen. The afternoon was steadily going too, and he was letting it go. One bright transit of daylight gone by unacknowledged. There was something unmanly, recusant in it. He could not quite reconcile himself to the fact. He felt he ought to get up, go out quickly into the daylight, and work or spend himself energetically in the open air of the afternoon, retrieving what was left to him of the day. But he did not go. Well, one might as well be hung for a sheep as for a lamb. If he had lost this day of his life, he had lost it. He gave it up. He was not going to count his losses. She didn't care. She didn't care in the least. Then why should he? Should he be behind her in recklessness and independence? She was superb in her indifference. He wanted to be like her. She took her responsibilities lightly. When she spilled her tea on the pillow, she rubbed it carelessly with a handkerchief and turned over the pillow. He would have felt guilty. She did not, and it pleased him. It pleased him very much to see how these things did not matter to her. When the meal was over, she wiped her mouth on her handkerchief quickly, satisfied and happy, and settled down on the pillow again, with her fingers in his close, strange, fur-like hair. The evening began to fall. The light was half alive, livid. He hid his face against her. "I don't like the twilight," he said. "I love it," she answered. He hid his face against her, who was warm and like sunlight. She seemed to have sunlight inside her. Her heart beating seemed like sunlight upon him. In her was a more real day than the day could give, so warm and steady and restoring. He hid his face against her whilst the twilight fell, whilst she lay staring out with her unseeing dark eyes, as if she wandered forth untrammeled in the vagueness. The vagueness gave her scope and set her free. To him, turned towards her heart pulse, all was very still and very warm and very close, like noontide. He was glad to know this warm, full noon. It ripened him and took away his responsibility, some of his conscience. They got up when it was quite dark. She hastily twisted her hair into a knot and was dressed in a twinkling. Then they went downstairs, drew to the fire, and sat in silence, saying a few words now and then. Her father was coming. She bundled the dishes away, flew round and tidied the room, assumed another character, and again seated herself. He sat thinking of his carving of Eve. He loved to go over his carving in his mind, dwelling on every stroke, every line. How he loved it now. When he went back to his creation panel again, he would finish his Eve, tender and sparkling. It did not satisfy him yet. The Lord should labor over her in a silent passion of creation, and Adam should be tense as if in a dream of immortality, and Eve should take form glimmeringly, shadowily, as if the Lord must wrestle with his own soul for her. Yet she was a radiance. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. He found it difficult to say. His soul became shy when he tried to communicate it. "I was thinking my Eve was too hard and lively." "Why?" "I don't know. She should be more." He made a gesture of infinite tenderness. There was a stillness with a little joy. He could not tell her any more. Why could he not tell her any more? She felt a pang of disconsolate sadness, but it was nothing. She went to him. Her father came and found them both very glowing, like an open flower. He loved to sit with them, where there was a perfume of love. Anyone who came must breathe it. They were both very quick and alive, lit up from the other world, so that it was quite an experience for them, that anyone else could exist. But still it troubled Brangwen a little, in his orderly, conventional mind, that the established rule of things had gone so utterly. One ought to get up in the morning and wash oneself and be a decent social being. Instead, the two of them stayed in bed till nightfall, and then got up. She never washed her face, but sat there talking to her father as bright and shameless as a daisy opened out of the dew. Or she got up at 10 o'clock and quite blithely went to bed again at 3 or at 4:30, stripping him naked in the daylight, and all so gladly and perfectly, oblivious quite of his qualms. He let her do as she liked with him, and shone with strange pleasure. She was to dispose of him as she would. He was translated with gladness to be in her hands. And down went his qualms, his maxims, his rules, his smaller beliefs. She scattered them like an expert skittle player. He was very much astonished and delighted to see them scatter. He stood and gazed and grinned with wonder, whilst his tablets of stone went bounding and bumping and splintering down the hill, dislodged forever. Indeed, it was true as they said, that a man wasn't born before he was married. What a change indeed! He surveyed the rind of the world, houses, factories, trams, the discarded rind, people scurrying about, work going on, all on the discarded surface. An earthquake had burst it all from inside. It was as if the surface of the world had been broken away entire. Ilkeston, streets, church, people, work, rule of the day, all intact, and yet peeled away into unreality, leaving here exposed the inside, the reality, one's own being, strange feelings and passions and yearnings and beliefs and aspirations, suddenly become present, revealed, the permanent bedrock, knitted one rock with the woman one loved. It was confounding. Things are not what they seem. When he was a child, he had thought a woman was a woman merely by virtue of her skirts and petticoats. And now, lo, the whole world could be divested of its garment. The garment could lie there shed away intact, and one could stand in a new world, a new earth, naked in a new, naked universe. It was too astounding and miraculous. This then was marriage. The old things didn't matter anymore. One got up at 4 o'clock and had broth at tea time and made toffee in the middle of the night. One didn't put on one's clothes, or one did put on one's clothes. He still was not quite sure it was not criminal, but it was a discovery to find one might be so supremely absolved. All that mattered was that he should love her, and she should love him, and they should live kindled to one another, like the Lord in 2 burning bushes that were not consumed. And so they lived for the time. She was less hampered than he, so she came more quickly to her fullness, and was sooner ready to enjoy again a return to the outside world. She was going to give a tea party. His heart sank. He wanted to go on as they were. He wanted to have done with the outside world, to declare it finished forever. He was anxious with a deep desire and anxiety that she should stay with him where they were in the timeless universe of free, perfect limbs and immortal breast, affirming that the old outward order was finished. The new order was begun to last forever, the living life, palpitating from the gleaming core to action, without crust or cover or outward lie. But no, he could not keep her. She wanted the dead world again. She wanted to walk on the outside, once more. She was going to give a tea party. It made him frightened and furious and miserable. He was afraid all would be lost that he had so newly come into, like the youth in the fairy tale, who was king for 1 day in the year, and for the rest a beaten herd, like Cinderella also, at the feast. He was sullen, but she blithely began to make preparations for her tea party. His fear was too strong. He was troubled. He hated her shallow anticipation and joy. Was she not forfeiting the reality, the one reality, for all that was shallow and worthless? Wasn't she carelessly taking off her crown to be an artificial figure, having other artificial women to tea, when she might have been perfect with him and kept him perfect in the land of intimate connection? Now he must be deposed. His joy must be destroyed. He must put on the vulgar, shallow death of an outward existence. He ground his soul in uneasiness and fear. But she rose to a real outburst of housework, turning him away as she shoved the furniture aside to her broom. He stood hanging miserable near. He wanted her back. Dread and desire for her to stay with him, and shame at his own dependence on her drove him to anger. He began to lose his head. The wonder was going to pass away again. All the love, the magnificent new order was going to be lost. She would forfeit it all for the outside things. She would admit the outside world again. She would throw away the living fruit for the ostensible rind. He began to hate this in her. Driven by fear of her departure into a state of helplessness, almost of imbecility, he wandered about the house. And she, with her skirts kilted up, flew round at her work, absorbed. "Shake the rug then, if you must hang round," she said, and fretting with resentment. He went to shake the rug. She was blithely unconscious of him. He came back, hanging near to her. "Can't you do anything?" she said, as if to a child impatiently. "Can't you do your woodwork?" "Where shall I do it?" he asked, harsh with pain. "Anywhere." How furious that made him. "Or go for a walk," she continued. "Go down to the marsh. Don't hang about as if you were only half there." He winced and hated it. He went away to read. Never had his soul felt so flayed and uncreated. And soon he must come down again to her. His hovering near her, wanting her to be with him, the futility of him, the way his hands hung, irritated her beyond bearing. She turned on him blindly and destructively. He became a mad creature, black and electric with fury. The dark storms rose in him. His eyes glowed black and evil. He was fiendish in his thwarted soul. There followed 2 black and ghastly days, when she was set in anguish against him, and he felt as if he were in a black, violent underworld, and his wrists quivered murderously. And she resisted him. He seemed a dark, almost evil thing, pursuing her, hanging on to her, burdening her. She would give anything to have him removed. "You need some work to do," she said. "You ought to be at work. Can't you do something?" His soul only grew the blacker. His condition now became complete. The darkness of his soul was thorough. Everything had gone. He remained complete in his own tense, black will. He was now unaware of her. She did not exist. His dark, passionate soul had recoiled upon itself, and now, clinched and coiled round a center of hatred, existed in its own power. There was a curiously ugly pallor and expressionlessness in his face. She shuddered from him. She was afraid of him. His will seemed grappled upon her. She retreated before him. She went down to the marsh. She entered again the immunity of her parents' love for her. He remained at U Cottage, black and clinched, his mind dead. He was unable to work at his woodcarving. He went on working monotonously at the garden, blindly like a mole. As she came home, up the hill, looking away at the town dim and blue on the hill, her heart relaxed and became yearning. She did not want to fight him anymore. She wanted love, oh, love. Her feet began to hurry. She wanted to get back to him. Her heart became tight with yearning for him. He had been making the garden in order, cutting the edges of the turf, laying the path with stones. He was a good, capable workman. "How nice you've made it," she said, approaching tentatively down the path. But he did not heed. He did not hear. His brain was solid and dead. "Haven't you made it nice?" she repeated, rather plaintively. He looked up at her, with that fixed, expressionless face and unseeing eyes which shocked her, made her go dazed and blind. Then he turned away. She saw his slender, stooping figure groping. A revulsion came over her. She went indoors. As she took off her hat in the bedroom, she found herself weeping bitterly, with some of the old, anguished, childish desolation. She sat still and cried on. She did not want him to know. She was afraid of his hard, evil moments. The head dropped a little, rigidly, in a crouching, cruel way. She was afraid of him. He seemed to lacerate her sensitive femaleness. He seemed to hurt her womb, to take pleasure in torturing her. He came into the house. The sound of his footsteps and his heavy boots filled her with horror, a hard, cruel, malignant sound. She was afraid he would come upstairs, but he did not. She waited apprehensively. He went out. Where she was most vulnerable, he hurt her. Oh, where she was delivered over to him. In her very soft femaleness, he seemed to lacerate her and desecrate her. She pressed her hands over her womb in anguish, whilst the tears ran down her face. And why? Why was he like this? Suddenly, she dried her tears. She must get the tea ready. She went downstairs and set the table. When the meal was ready, she called to him. "I've mashed the tea. Will, are you coming?" She herself could hear the sound of tears in her own voice, and she began to cry again. He did not answer, but went on with his work. She waited a few minutes in anguish. Fear came over her. She was panic-stricken with terror, like a child, and she could not go home again to her father. She was held by the power in this man who had taken her. She turned indoors so that he should not see her tears. She sat down to table. Presently, he came into the scullery. His movements jarred on her as she heard them. How horrible was the way he pumped, exacerbating, so cruel. How she hated to hear him. How he hated her. How his hatred was like blows upon her. The tears were coming again. He came in, his face wooden and lifeless, fixed, persistent. He sat down to tea, his head dropped over his cup, uglily. His hands were red from the cold water, and there were rims of earth in his nails. He went on with his tea. It was his negative insensitiveness to her that she could not bear, something clayey and ugly. His intelligence was self-absorbed. How unnatural it was to sit with a self-absorbed creature, like something negative ensconced opposite one. Nothing could touch him. He could only absorb things into his own self. The tears were running down her face. Something startled him, and he was looking up at her with his hateful, hard, bright eyes, hard and unchanging as a bird of prey. "What are you crying for?" came the grating voice. She winced through her womb. She could not stop crying. "What are you crying for?" came the question again, in just the same tone. And still there was silence, with only the sniff of her tears. His eyes glittered, and as if with malignant desire. She shrank and became blind. She was like a bird being beaten down. A sort of swoon of helplessness came over her. She was of another order than he. She had no defense against him. Against such an influence, she was only vulnerable. She was given up. He rose and went out of the house, possessed by the evil spirit. It tortured him and racked him and fought in him. And whilst he worked, in the deepening twilight, it left him. Suddenly, he saw that she was hurt. He had only seen her triumphant before. Suddenly, his heart was torn with compassion for her. He became alive again, in an anguish of compassion. He could not bear to think of her tears. He could not bear it. He wanted to go to her and pour out his heart's blood to her. He wanted to give everything to her, all his blood, his life, to the last dregs, pour everything away to her. He yearned with passionate desire to offer himself to her, utterly. The evening star came, and the night. She had not lighted the lamp. His heart burned with pain and with grief. He trembled to go to her, and at last he went, hesitating, burdened with a great offering. The hardness had gone out of him. His body was sensitive, slightly trembling. His hand was curiously sensitive, shrinking as he shut the door. He fixed the latch almost tenderly. In the kitchen was only the fireglow. He could not see her. He quivered with dread lest she had gone, he knew not where. In shrinking dread, he went through to the parlor, to the foot of the stairs. "Anna," he called. There was no answer. He went up the stairs, in dread of the empty house, the horrible emptiness that made his heart ring with insanity. He opened the bedroom door, and his heart flashed with certainty that she had gone, that he was alone. But he saw her on the bed, lying very still and scarcely noticeable, with her back to him. He went and put his hand on her shoulder, very gently, hesitating, in a great fear and self-offering. She did not move. He waited. The hand that touched her shoulder hurt him, as if she were sending it away. He stood dim with pain. "Anna," he said. But still she was motionless, like a curled-up, oblivious creature. His heart beat with strange throes of pain. Then, by a motion under his hand, he knew she was crying, holding herself hard so that her tears should not be known. He waited. The tension continued. Perhaps she was not crying, then suddenly relapsed with a sharp catch of a sob. His heart flamed with love and suffering for her. Kneeling carefully on the bed so that his earthy boots should not touch it, he took her in his arms to comfort her. The sobs gathered in her. She was sobbing bitterly, but not to him. She was still away from him. He held her against his breast whilst she sobbed, withheld from him, and all his body vibrated against her. Don't cry," he said, with an odd simplicity. His heart was calm and numb with a sort of innocence of love, now. She still sobbed, ignoring him, ignoring that he held her. His lips were dry. "Don't cry, my love," he said, in the same abstract way. In his breast his heart burned like a torch, with suffering. He could not bear the desolateness of her crying. He would have soothed her with his blood. He heard the church clock chime, as if it touched him, and he waited in suspense for it to have gone by. It was quiet again. "My love," he said to her, bending to touch her wet face with his mouth. He was afraid to touch her. How wet her face was. His body trembled as he held her. He loved her till he felt his heart, and all his veins would burst and flood her with his hot, healing blood. He knew his blood would heal and restore her. She was becoming quieter. He thanked the God of mercy that at last she was becoming quieter. His head felt so strange and blazed. Still he held her close, with trembling arms. His blood seemed very strong, enveloping her. And at last she began to draw near to him. She nestled to him. His limbs, his body, took fire and beat up in flames. She clung to him. She cleaved to his body. The flames swept him. He held her in sinews of fire. If she would kiss him, he bent his mouth down, and her mouth, soft and moist, received him. He felt his veins would burst with anguish of thankfulness. His heart was mad with gratefulness. He could pour himself out upon her forever. When they came to themselves, the night was very dark. 2 hours had gone by. They lay still and warm and weak, like the newborn, together. And there was a silence almost of the unborn. Only his heart was weeping happily after the pain. He did not understand. He had yielded, given way. There was no understanding. There could be only acquiescence and submission and tremulous wonder of consummation. The next morning, when they woke up, it had snowed. He wondered what was the strange pallor in the air and the unusual tang. Snow was on the grass and the windowsill. It weighed down the black, ragged branches of the yews and smoothed the graves in the churchyard. Soon, it began to snow again, and they were shut in. He was glad, for then they were immune in a shadowy silence. There was no world, no time. The snow lasted for some days. On the Sunday, they went to church. They made a line of footprints across the garden. He left a flat snowprint of his hand on the wall as he vaulted over. They traced the snow across the churchyard. For 3 days, they had been immune in a perfect love. There were very few people in church, and she was glad. She did not care much for church. She had never questioned any beliefs, and she was, from habit and custom, a regular attendant at morning service. But she had ceased to come with any anticipation. Today, however, in the strangeness of snow, after such consummation of love, she felt expectant again and delighted. She was still in the eternal world. She used, after she went to the high school and wanted to be a lady, wanted to fulfill some mysterious ideal, always to listen to the sermon and to try to gather suggestions. That was all very well for a while. The vicar told her to be good in this way and in that. She went away feeling it was her highest aim to fulfill these injunctions. But quickly this palled. After a short time, she was not very much interested in being good. Her soul was in quest of something, which was not just being good and doing one's best. No, she wanted something else, something that was not her ready-made duty. Everything seemed to be merely a matter of social duty and never of herself. They talked about her soul, but somehow never managed to rouse or to implicate her soul. As yet her soul was not brought in at all. So that whilst she had an affection for Mr. Loverseed, the vicar, and a protective sort of feeling for Kossethay Church, wanting always to help it and defend it, it counted very small in her life. Not but that she was conscious of some unsatisfaction. When her husband was roused by the thought of the churches, then she became hostile to the ostensible church. She hated it for not fulfilling anything in her. The church told her to be good. Very well, she had no idea of contradicting what it said. The church talked about her soul, about the welfare of mankind, as if the saving of her soul lay in her performing certain acts conducive to the welfare of mankind. Well and good, it was so, then. Nevertheless, as she sat in church, her face had a pathos and poignancy. Was this what she had come to hear? How by doing this thing and by not doing that, she could save her soul? She did not contradict it, but the pathos of her face gave the lie. There was something else she wanted to hear. It was something else she asked for from the church. But who was she to affirm it? And what was she doing with unsatisfied desires? She was ashamed. She ignored them and left them out of count as much as possible, her underneath yearnings. They angered her. She wanted to be like other people, decently satisfied. He angered her more than ever. Church had an irresistible attraction for him, and he paid no more attention to that part of the service which was church to her than if he had been an angel or a fabulous beast sitting there. He simply paid no heed to the sermon or to the meaning of the service. There was something thick, dark, dense, powerful about him that irritated her too deeply for her to speak of it. The church teaching in itself meant nothing to him. And forgive us our trespasses as we forgive them that trespass against us. It simply did not touch him. It might have been more sounds, and it would have acted upon him in the same way. He did not want things to be intelligible, and he did not care about his trespasses, neither about the trespasses of his neighbor. When he was in church, leave that care for weekdays. When he was in church, he took no more notice of his daily life. It was weekday stuff. As for the welfare of mankind, he merely did not realize that there was any such thing, except on weekdays, when he was good-natured enough. In church, he wanted a dark, nameless emotion, the emotion of all the great mysteries of passion. He was not interested in the thought of himself or of her. Oh, and how that irritated her. He ignored the sermon. He ignored the greatness of mankind. He did not admit the immediate importance of mankind. He did not care about himself as a human being. He did not attach any vital importance to his life in the drafting office or his life among men. That was just merely the margin to the text. The verity was his connection with Anna and his connection with the church. His real being lay in his dark emotional experience of the infinite, of the absolute. And the great mysterious, illuminated capitals to the text were his feelings with the church. It exasperated her beyond measure. She could not get out of the church the satisfaction he got. The thought of her soul was intimately mixed up with the thought of her own self. Indeed, her soul and her own self were one and the same in her, whereas he seemed simply to ignore the fact of his own self, almost to refute it. He had a soul, a dark, inhuman thing caring nothing for humanity. So she conceived it, and in the gloom and the mystery of the church his soul lived and ran free, like some strange, underground thing, abstract. He was very strange to her, and, in this church spirit, in conceiving himself as a soul, he seemed to escape and run free of her. In a way, she envied him, this dark freedom and jubilation of the soul, some strange entity in him. It fascinated her. Again, she hated it. And again, she despised him, wanted to destroy it in him. This snowy morning, he sat with a dark, bright face beside her, not aware of her, and somehow, she felt he was conveying to strange, secret places the love that sprang in him for her. He sat with a dark-wrapped, half-delighted face, looking at a little stained window. She saw the ruby-colored glass, with the shadow heaped along the bottom from the snow outside, and the familiar yellow figure of the lamb holding the banner, a little darkened now, but in the murky interior strangely luminous, pregnant. She had always liked the little red and yellow window. The lamb, looking very silly and self-conscious, was holding up a forepaw, in the cleft of which was dangerously perched a little flag with a red cross. Very pale yellow, the lamb, with greenish shadows. Since she was a child, she had liked this creature, with the same feeling she felt for the little woolly lambs on green legs that children carried home from the fair every year. She had always liked these toys, and she had the same amused, childish liking for this church lamb. Yet she had always been uneasy about it. She was never sure that this lamb with a flag did not want to be more than it appeared. So she half mistrusted it. There was a mixture of dislike in her attitude to it. Now, by a curious gathering, knitting of his eyes, the faintest tension of ecstasy on his face, he gave her the uncomfortable feeling that he was in correspondence with the creature, the lamb in the window. A cold wonder came over her. Her soul was perplexed. There he sat, motionless, timeless, with the faint, bright tension on his face. What was he doing? What connection was there between him and the lamb in the glass? Suddenly, it gleamed to her dominant, this lamb with the flag. Suddenly, she had a powerful mystic experience. The power of the tradition seized on her. She was transported to another world. And she hated it, resisted it. Instantly, it was only a silly lamb in the glass again. And dark, violent hatred of her husband swept up in her. What was he doing? Sitting there gleaming, carried away, soulful? She shifted sharply. She knocked him as she pretended to pick up her glove. She groped among his feet. He came to, rather bewildered, exposed. Anybody but her would have pitied him. She wanted to rend him. He did not know what was amiss, what he had been doing. As they sat at dinner in their cottage, he was dazed by the chill of antagonism from her. She did not know why she was so angry, but she was incensed. "Why do you never listen to the sermon?" she asked, seething with hostility and violation.
"I do," he said.
You don't hear a single word." He retired into himself to enjoy his own sensation. There was something subterranean about him, as if he had an underworld refuge. The young girl hated to be in the house with him when he was like this. After dinner, he retired into the parlor, continuing in the same state of abstraction, which was a burden intolerable to her. Then he went to the bookshelf and took down books to look at, that she had scarcely glanced over. He sat absorbed over a book on the illuminations in old missals, and then over a book on paintings in churches, Italian, English, French, and German. He had, when he was 16, discovered a Roman Catholic bookshop where he could find such things. He turned the leaves in absorption, absorbed in looking, not thinking. He was like a man whose eyes were in his chest, she said of him later. She came to look at the things with him. Half they fascinated her. She was puzzled, interested, and antagonistic. It was when she came to pictures of the Pietà that she burst out. "I do think they're loathsome," she cried. "What?" he said, surprised, abstracted. "Those bodies with slits in them, posing to be worshipped. You see, it means the sacraments, the bread," he said slowly.
"Does it?" she cried.
"Then it's worse. I don't want to see your chest slit, nor to eat your dead body, even if you offer it to me. Can't you see it's horrible? It isn't me, it's Christ. What if it is, it's you? And it's horrible, you wallowing in your own dead body and thinking of eating it in the sacrament. You have to take it for what it means. It means your human body put up to be slit and killed and then worshipped. What else?" They lapsed into silence. His soul grew angry and aloof. "And I think that lamb in church," she said, "is the biggest joke in the parish." She burst into a poof of ridiculing laughter. "It might be, to those that see nothing in it," he said. "You know it's the symbol of Christ, of his innocence and sacrifice." "Whatever it means, it's a lamb," she said. "And I like lambs too much to treat them as if they had to mean something. As for the Christmas tree flag, no." And again she poofed with mockery. "It's because you don't know anything," he said violently, harshly. "Laugh at what you know, not at what you don't know. What don't I know? What things mean? And what does it mean?" He was reluctant to answer her. He found it difficult. "What does it mean?" she insisted. "It means the triumph of the resurrection." She hesitated, baffled. A fear came upon her. What were these things? Something dark and powerful seemed to extend before her. Was it wonderful after all? But no, she refused it. Whatever it may pretend to mean, what it is a silly, absurd toy lamb with a Christmas tree flag ledged on its paw, and if it wants to mean anything else, it must look different from that. He was in a state of violent irritation against her. Partly, he was ashamed of his love for these things. He hid his passion for them. He was ashamed of the ecstasy into which he could throw himself with these symbols. And for a few moments, he hated the lamb and the mystic pictures of the Eucharist with a violent, ashy hatred. His fire was put out. She had thrown cold water on it. The whole thing was distasteful to him. His mouth was full of ashes. He went out cold with corpse-like anger, leaving her alone. He hated her. He walked through the white snow, under a sky of lead. And she wept again, in bitter recurrence of the previous gloom. But her heart was easy. Oh, much more easy. She was quite willing to make it up with him when he came home again. He was black and surly, but abetted. She had broken a little of something in him. And at length he was glad to forfeit from his soul all his symbols, to have her making love to him. He loved it when she put her head on his knee, and he had not asked her to or wanted her to. He loved her when she put her arms round him and made bold love to him, and he did not make love to her. He felt a strong blood in his limbs again. And she loved the intent, far look of his eyes when they rested on her. Intent, yet far, not near, not with her. And she wanted to bring them near. She wanted his eyes to come to hers, to know her. And they would not. They remained intent, and far, and proud, like a hawk's naive and inhuman as a hawk's. So she loved him and caressed him and roused him like a hawk, till he was keen and instant, but without tenderness. He came to her fierce and hard, like a hawk striking and taking her. He was no mystic anymore. She was his aim and object, his prey. And she was carried off, and he was satisfied, or satiated at last. Then immediately she began to retaliate on him. She too was a hawk. If she imitated the pathetic plover running plaintive to him, that was part of the game. When he, satisfied, moved with a proud, insolent slouch of the body and a half-contemptuous drop of the head, unaware of her, ignoring her very existence. After taking his fill of her and getting his satisfaction of her, her soul roused. Its pinions became like steel, and she struck at him. When he sat on his perch glancing sharply round with solitary pride eminent and fierce, she dashed at him and threw him from his station savagely. She goaded him from his keen dignity of a male. She harassed him from his unperturbed pride, till he was mad with rage. His light brown eyes burned with fury. They saw her now. Like flames of anger, they flared at her and recognized her as the enemy. Very good. She was the enemy, very good. As he prowled round her, she watched him. As he struck at her, she struck back. He was angry because she had carelessly pushed away his tools so that they got rusty. "Don't leave them littering in my way, then," she said. "I shall leave them where I like," he cried. "Then I shall throw them where I like." They glowered at each other, he with rage in his hands, she with her soul fierce with victory. They were very well matched. They would fight it out. She turned to her sewing. Immediately the tea things were cleared away. She fetched out the stuff, and his soul rose in rage. He hated beyond measure to hear the shriek of Calico as she tore the web sharply, as if with pleasure. And the run of the sewing machine gathered a frenzy in him at last. "Aren't you going to stop that row?" he shouted. "Can't you do it in the daytime?" She looked up sharply, hostile from her work. "No, I can't do it in the daytime. I have other things to do. Besides, I like sewing, and you're not going to stop me doing it." Whereupon she turned back to her arranging, fixing, stitching. His nerves jumped with anger as the sewing machine started and stuttered and buzzed. But she was enjoying herself. She was triumphant and happy as the darting needle danced ecstatically down a hem, drawing the stuff along under its vivid stabbing, irresistibly. She made the machine hum. She stopped it imperiously. Her fingers were deft and swift and mistress. If he sat behind her stiff with impotent rage, it only made a trembling vividness come into her energy. On she worked. At last he went to bed in a rage and lay stiff, away from her. And she turned her back on him. And in the morning they did not speak, except in mere cold civilities. And when he came home at night, his heart relenting and growing hot for love of her, when he was just ready to feel he had been wrong, and when he was expecting her to feel the same, there she sat at the sewing machine. The whole house was covered with clipped calico. The kettle was not even on the fire. She started up, affecting concern. "Is it so late?" she cried. But his face had gone stiff with rage. He walked through to the parlor. Then he walked back and out of the house again. Her heart sank. Very swiftly, she began to make his tea. He went black-hearted down the road to Ilkeston. When he was in this state, he never thought. A bolt shot across the doors of his mind and shut him in, a prisoner. He went back to Ilkeston and drank a glass of beer. What was he going to do? He did not want to see anybody. He would go to Nottingham, to his own town. He went to the station and took a train. When he got to Nottingham, still he had nowhere to go. However, it was more agreeable to walk familiar streets. He paced them with a mad restlessness, as if he were running amok. Then he turned to a bookshop and found a book on Bamberg Cathedral. Here was a discovery. Here was something for him. He went into a quiet restaurant to look at his treasure. He lit up with thrills of bliss as he turned from picture to picture. He had found something at last in these carvings. His soul had great satisfaction. Had he not come out to seek? And had he not found? He was in a passion of fulfillment. These were the finest carvings, statues he had ever seen. The book lay in his hands like a doorway. The world around was only an enclosure, a room. But he was going away. He lingered over the lovely statues of women. A marvelous, finely wrought universe crystallized out around him as he looked again at the crowns, the twining hair, the woman faces. He liked all the better the unintelligible text of the German. He preferred things he could not understand with the mind. He loved the undiscovered and the undiscoverable. He pored over the pictures intensely. And these were wooden statues. Holes, he believed, that meant wood. Wooden statues so sharp-end to his soul. He was a million times gladdened. How undiscovered the world was, how it revealed itself to his soul. What a fine, exciting thing his life was at his hand. Did not Bamberg Cathedral make the world his own? He celebrated his triumphant strength and life and verity, and embraced the vast riches he was inheriting. But it was about time to go home. He had better catch a train. All the time there was a steady bruise at the bottom of his soul, but so steady as to be forgettable. He caught a train for Ilkeston. It was 10